In the mid-1960s, newspapers across West Germany began referring to one fighter aircraft in particular by a bit of a grim nickname: the Widowmaker. Crashes dominated the headlines, young military pilots were dying at an alarming rate, and to add insult to injury, politicians found themselves accused of accepting millions of dollars in bribes, all for the purchase of a military aircraft that many believe should never have existed in the first place. And yet, at almost exactly the same time, pilots in other countries like Italy, Japan and elsewhere regarded that very same aircraft as one of the finest interceptors ever built. This aircraft was breathtakingly fast, capable of climbing higher and accelerating harder than almost anything else in the sky, and in their hands at least, it would remain in frontline military service for nearly half a century. So, how could one aircraft earn such completely opposite reputations? One narrative is that the Lockheed F-104 Starfighter was a dangerously flawed design, one that sacrificed safety in pursuit of speed and climb performance. While others say that it was actually a brilliant aircraft, but one which unfortunately spent most of its time in service performing missions that it had never been designed for. And depending on how you look at it, both of these theories could be true, or false. And to get to grips with this contradiction, the first thing we need to understand is that, unlike many of the aircraft we've covered on this channel, the Starfighter wasn't designed to escort bombers across oceans or continents, or carry large bomb loads, or even excel in close-range dogfights. Instead, this unusual-looking fighter was conceived to solve a very specific problem that emerged during the Korean War. When North Korea invaded the South in June of 1950, the US Air Force entered the conflict expecting that its newest jet fighters would enjoy a decisive technological advantage. Now, it took both sides some time to bring forward their best jets, but when they did, the US Air Force's expectations initially seemed to be justified. But then, almost overnight, a new Soviet-designed fighter began appearing over the Yalu River, the MiG-15. This nimble fighter was unlike anything American pilots had faced before. Its design and power meant that it could climb faster than the aircraft sent to face it. Plus, once it reached those higher altitudes, it still possessed enough speed, maneuverability and firepower to threaten even the massive B-29 Superfortress, an aircraft that had dominated the skies only a few years earlier during World War II. The arrival of the MiG forced the United States to respond quickly by accelerating the development of the North American F-86 Sabre, which ultimately proved capable of matching its Soviet rival. But by the end of the conflict, American pilots and planners believed that future fighters would need to place a far greater emphasis on speed, climb performance and altitude than ever before. And at the same time, the Soviet Union was rapidly expanding its long-range bomber force. Aircraft such as the Topolov Tu-95 Bear and the Topolov Tu-16 Badger were designed to deliver nuclear weapons against targets in North America and Western Europe, presenting NATO with a new strategic challenge. If those aircraft ever appeared on radar, NATO would only have minutes to respond, making speed and climb performance far more important than endurance or agility. Now, the challenge of designing something to meet these requirements fell to Lockheed's legendary chief engineer, Clarence Kelly Johnson. And legend has it that even before Johnson sat at his drawing board, he spoke directly with fighter pilots returning from Korea, asking them what they actually wanted from their next aircraft. Again and again, these pilots said that they wanted an aircraft that would accelerate rapidly, climb like a homesick angel, and could reach enemy aircraft before they ever had a chance to attack. These pilots also recounted stories of enemy pilots over Korea that would first launch surprise attacks and then turn around and escape at high speed. So even when the pilots of these Soviet aircraft didn't succeed, they could still escape and live to fight another day, with American pilots unable to stop them. So, to Kelly Johnson, the message was clear. More than anything else, these Air Force pilots wanted something small, light, and really fast. And his answer to this was to keep things simple. He focused every aspect of the Starfighter's design around reducing weight and drag so the aircraft could accelerate as rapidly as possible and sustain extremely high speeds until it could intercept its targets. And by far the most obvious example of that philosophy was, of course, those absurdly small wings. They measured just over 6.5 meters from tip to tip, which was just over half the wingspan of other fighter jets of the same era. At the speeds Johnson expected the Starfighter to fly, large wings just simply weren't necessary. All they would have done was create additional drag that reduced performance. And these wings weren't just small, they were razor thin too. This meant that they generated very little wave drag as the aircraft approached and exceeded the speed of sound, allowing the Starfighter to accelerate cleanly through the transonic region where many earlier fighters had struggled. And here bear in mind that calling these wings razor thin almost wasn't just a figure of speech. The leading edges of these wings were so thin that they actually created some problems for ground personnel. They were literally sharp enough to injure anyone who walked into them, so maintenance crews quickly began fitting bright red protective covers whenever the aircraft was parked. And that no-compromise approach in the design of the F-104 was evident all over the aircraft, and one such example was in the escape system for the pilot. Early on, engineers feared an upward-firing ejection seat might send pilots into the T-tail, and so the first 104s were fitted with a downward-firing ejection seat. Now that design offered little chance of escape during low-altitude emergencies, and sadly ended up killing 21 American test pilots, so it was eventually replaced with a far more conventional upward-firing seat. Now the power also came from a revolutionary piece of technology. General Electric's new J79 turbojet was among the most powerful engines ever installed in a single-engine fighter at the time, producing more than 15,000 pounds of thrust with afterburner, and would later power more aircraft like the F-4 Phantom II. Combined with the aircraft's exceptionally clean aerodynamic design, this engine allowed the F-104 to become one of the first operational fighters capable of sustained flight at more than twice the speed of sound. And the aircraft's climb performance was equally astonishing. Pilots often described the F-104 as feeling more like a rocket than a conventional fighter, and the numbers seem to support that impression. Shortly after entering service, specially prepared starfighters shattered multiple world records for speed, altitude and time to climb, demonstrating that Kelly Johnson had achieved exactly what he set out to build. But those records and the uncompromising design that made them possible came with a steep price. And I'll tell you more about that after this. A journalist once found someone's home address in under 30 seconds using nothing but a name and a People search site. Why am I telling you this? Well, because it's pretty scary to think that anyone can do this pretty quickly and simply, and it's completely legal. But with today's sponsor Incogni, you can protect your privacy with zero effort. Here's how it works. You tell Incogni what personal information you want scrubbed, and they get to work, automatically scanning over 400 data broker sites for your data. When they find it, Incogni sends a removal request on your behalf, and they don't just stop there either. They keep checking back, since the same info has a habit of resurfacing months later. It's kind of like playing whack-a-mole with your information. Now, you could try doing this yourself, but it would take you hundreds of hours you'd probably rather spend elsewhere. And Incogni stays accountable, sending you a report every 7 days so you can see how your online footprint is shrinking in real time. And if you spot your own information somewhere that Incogni hasn't caught yet, their customs removal feature lets you submit that link directly to your dashboard for the team to look into. Head over to incogni.com/mentor now or scan this QR code to get 60% off their annual plan. Just remember to use code MENTOR now at checkout. Thanks Incogni. Now, let's get back to Jet Zero. The F-104's design meant that it excelled when it was flying fast, high and in a straight line towards a target. But the farther it was pushed away from that environment, the more demanding it became to fly. In fact, those tiny wings became a problem any time the aircraft slowed down. Obviously, small wings generate less lift, which meant that the F-104 had to fly much faster during takeoff and landing than almost any of its contemporaries. The aircraft's stall speed was significantly higher too than just about anything else out there, and as a result, landing speeds of around 180 knots weren't unusual, and that left pilots with very little margin for error. If pilots allowed the aircraft to slow too much on approach, lift disappeared rapidly, but if they carried too much speed, they risked floating down the runway or overrunning it altogether. Flying the Starfighter demanded precision, and it offered remarkably little forgiveness in return. Now, this wasn't necessarily a flaw, it was simply the inevitable consequence of designing a highly specialised aircraft optimised for one very specific mission: to be the world's best high-speed interceptor. The F-104 was designed to sit on alert, launch at a moment's notice, climb to altitude as quickly as possible, identify the intruder, which would typically be a formation of Soviet bombers, and destroy them before they reached their target. For a mission like that, carrying a large weapons load just wasn't a high priority. Even range was of secondary importance. What mattered was for the aircraft to have enough fuel to reach those high-value targets for a single high-speed intercept. If such a war really would come, there might not be time to recover and rearm the aircraft for a second mission anyway. And with that in mind, the design of the Starfighter, with its tiny wings and slim fuselage that was barely big enough for the pilot and the engine, started to make sense. That same configuration that allowed test aircraft to break so many altitude records meant that the F-104 could reach incoming bombers remarkably quickly, while its radar and guided missiles gave it the ability to engage targets at high altitude in almost any weather. Clearly, this fighter was never intended to dogfight, manoeuvre through mountain valleys, or linger over a battlefield in support of ground troops. And the United States Air Force initially embraced exactly this simplistic philosophy and brought the first operational starfighters into Air Defense Command during the late 1950s. But here's where the first problems started to appear. The F-104's career with the Air Force would prove surprisingly brief. Less than a year after the aircraft first entered service, the Air Defense Command started withdrawing the aircraft and handed them over to the Air National Guard. Now, the US Air Force would buy some later versions of the F-104 that would see service with Tactical Air Command units, but not in anything like the numbers that were originally planned. To be fair, at the time, many strategic planners within the US Department of Defense believed that newer, more capable surface-to-air missiles would assume much of the air defense mission. But with that said, other fighters were not sidelined as fast as the F-104. Soon, another generation of fighters, most notably the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom, promised greater range and much heavier weapon loads. The F-4 could also fly quickly and could climb fast, and crucially, it also had the flexibility to perform a far wider variety of missions than the highly specialised F-104. But very early on, Lockheed, the F-104's manufacturer, were not happy. They could see where the wind was blowing, but they were convinced that even if the US Air Force would only purchase a relatively modest number of starfighters, the aircraft's greatest commercial opportunity lay overseas. Across Europe, NATO air forces were beginning to replace large fleets of first-generation jet fighters, while also searching for an aircraft capable of carrying out the alliance's evolving doctrine of conventional strike, reconnaissance, air defence, and potentially delivering nuclear weapons inside Warsaw Pact territory. And other than air defence, that was a very different set of requirements from the one Kelly Johnson had originally designed the Starfighter for. Basically, that laundry list of requirements meant that most countries lining up to purchase a Starfighter actually wanted a multi-role combat aircraft, capable of performing almost every imaginable tactical mission, which really should have made it obvious that the F-104 just wasn't right for the role. But that's not how things worked out. What happened next shaped both the F-104's remarkable sales success and its enduring negative reputation. Now, Lockheed chose to adapt the aircraft and turn it into what the Europeans wanted. Working alongside several NATO partners, the company developed what became the F-104G. Although this variant retained the sleek appearance of the original Interceptor, it featured a strengthened airframe capable of withstanding the stresses of repeated low-level flight, more advanced navigation and attack equipment, wingtip tanks for increased fuel capacity, a slightly larger vertical fin for improved directional stability, and a host of other small changes, intended to transform the F-104 from a pure interceptor into a genuine multi-role combat aircraft. It was a gamble, but it paid off spectacularly. In 1958, West Germany selected the Starfighter as the cornerstone of its rapidly expanding post-war Luftwaffe, and before long, Belgium and the Netherlands, Italy, Canada and Denmark, Norway and several other allied nations had all placed orders. More than 2,000 F-104Gs would ultimately be built in Europe under license, making the Starfighter one of the largest multinational fighter programs of the Cold War. But that's not what the aircraft is remembered for, especially in what was then West Germany. During the 1970s, investigations conducted by the United States Senate revealed that Lockheed had spent millions of dollars bribing influential politicians and officials in several countries to encourage purchases of its military aircraft. Among those implicated were senior political figures in West Germany and also in Italy, the Netherlands and Japan. The scandal contributed to the resignation of the Japanese Prime Minister after revelations that he'd accepted Lockheed bribes. Now, to this day, historians still can't agree on how much those payments actually influenced individual competitions. But the revelations permanently damaged Lockheed's reputation and fueled public suspicion that it wasn't military necessity that had placed so many young pilots in the cockpit of an aircraft that by then had a growing disturbing reputation, but politics and corruption. And to understand why the Starfighter earned such a fearsome reputation in Germany, it's important to remember that the Luftwaffe was flying the F-104 as an attack aircraft, not an interceptor. So, instead of fleets of 104s sitting on alert, German crews spent much of their time training to fly at extremely low altitudes and at very high speeds. Their objective was to penetrate Warsaw Pact air defences by remaining below enemy radar until the very last moment, before striking their targets and sprinting back to base to rearm and refuel. But consistently flying just a few hundred feet above the ground leaves almost no time to recover from an engine or mechanical failure, spatial disorientation, or just a momentary lapse in concentration. Pilots had to navigate at speeds approaching 600 knots while constantly monitoring terrain, weather, aircraft systems, and the possibility of enemy air defence. The Starfighter could perform these missions, particularly in its strengthened 104G configuration, but it demanded precision every second it was airborne. The aircraft's high wing loading, rapid landing speeds, and unforgiving handling characteristics meant that mistakes which might be survivable in another fighter often became catastrophic in the F-104. And the environment wasn't helping either. German crews trained year-round throughout rain, low cloud, fog and winter weather, while the rapid expansion of the newly re-established Luftwaffe meant that hundreds of relatively inexperienced pilots were transitioning onto one of the world's most demanding high-performance aircraft all at the same time. And a lot of these pilots had received their initial training in Arizona, which really didn't prepare them for the harsh weather of northern Germany. The result was a succession of accidents that quickly captured public attention. Between 1961 and 1989, the Luftwaffe lost 292 of its 916 starfighters, with 116 pilots killed. Those numbers understandably shocked the German public and cemented the aircraft's reputation as dangerous. Now, investigations found no single design flaw that explained these losses, but they pointed to a combination of demanding low-level operations, evolving maintenance practices, inadequate early training, challenging weather, and unsurprisingly, an unforgiving aircraft with a relatively narrow operating envelope. Now, as these lessons were learned, training improved, maintenance standards matured, and safer ejection seats were introduced, and gradually the accident rate declined. And by the later years of the Starfighter's career, it had become just as safe as any other aircraft in the Luftwaffe, but by then, its reputation had already been firmly established. Eventually, more than a dozen air forces flew the aircraft, including those of Canada, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, Japan, Taiwan, Pakistan, Greece, Turkey, Spain, and Jordan. And it's worth noting here that the F-104 had a much better safety record in countries with relatively good weather, although in many cases that came after the painful lessons in Germany, so it's likely that all newer operators were aware of its reputation and treated it accordingly. The Starfighter saw combat during Indo-Pakistani wars, spent decades standing quick reaction alert around the world, and continually evolved through new radar, avionics and weapons upgrades, long after many observers expected it to disappear. but no operator used the aircraft longer than Italy. Successive variants of the F-104 remained on frontline duty into the 21st century, with the final Italian starfighters retiring in 2004 after nearly 50 years of military service. And that remarkable longevity perhaps says more about the aircraft than any nickname ever could. Now, the F-104 was never truly successful as the multi-role fighter that many nations wanted it to be. But it proved far more capable than its reputation alone would suggest, and it ended up outlasting many other Cold War fighters. The Starfighter also became one of the Cold War's most fascinating flying laboratories. Its performance made it attractive for generations of engineers who repeatedly turned the F-104 into a test platform. And one of the most unusual experiments was the zero-length launch system, in which the F-104 was mounted on a trailer and blasted into the air using a massive rocket booster. The idea was that if NATO airfields were destroyed in a surprise attack, fighters could still be dispersed throughout forests and hidden sites before launching without a conventional runway. However, recovery still required a runway, making the concept less practical than it first appeared, but it perfectly demonstrates the extraordinary thinking that characterized Cold War military planning. That same spirit of experimentation also produced the remarkable NF-104A. Fitted with an additional rocket engine and reaction control thrusters in its nose and wingtips, it was designed to explore the transition between conventional flight and the edge of space, where normal aerodynamic forces became ineffective. That aircraft was designed to fly at altitudes above 100,000 feet and help train test pilots for rocket-powered flight and the X-15 program. Although it's perhaps best remembered as the aircraft in which Chuck Yeager narrowly survived a dramatic high-altitude accident after entering an unrecoverable flat spin. And finally, it's worth noting that even though the F-104 remained in the US Air Force service for only a few short years, weirdly, its legacy continues to impact the US Air Force to this day. Before Air Force officials could realise just how quickly the Starfighter would become obsolete, they decided that they'd better come up with a trainer aircraft that would prepare new pilots for the uniquely demanding characteristics of fighters like the F-104. So, in 1961, the Air Force got a new trainer, the Northrop T-38 Talon, which is still the main jet trainer for the Air Force today. Now, I know I'm oversimplifying the T-38 story here, but the trainer's final configuration with its very small, thin wings really does owe a lot to the kind of thinking that had previously led to the adoption of the F-104. But what do you think? Should the F-104 have remained in service for as long as it did? And can you think of another military aircraft from the Cold War era that you'd like us to cover? Let us know in the comments below. I'm Ben Watts. You're watching Mentour now. Have an amazing week, and I will see you next time.